All right, here we are. Welcome aboard our new webinar for March. Today is Wednesday, March 18th, and this webinar will be a 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock special. Could be a little longer, could be a little shorter, depends how many questions we get. I'm so happy to see so many people joining. And this will be fun. We'll talk about one of my favorite things to discuss, something that's been part of my DNA since I was a very young law clerk, lawyer in New York City. So this will be fun. We'll go over so many parts of Medicaid. This hopefully will make sense because I think there's nothing that we do that's more misunderstood, more creates more difficulties than Medicaid planning. So that's why when we named this webinar Medicaid Myths and Truths, we're kind of demystifying the whole subject of Medicaid in New York State, which again is different from Medicaid everywhere else. And I think the thing about Medicaid that's so confusing is nobody quite understands, what this system is. So I think before we jump in, we'll do some housekeeping. We'll talk about myself because why not? We're here, and then dive into Medicaid and all of its intricacies and all of its nuances, and just have some fun with it because Medicaid is a major part of what we do as an elder law firm, and it's also something that really does help families that have to struggle to pay for long-term care. New York is one of the best states in the United States to deal with Medicaid. But you know what? We'll jump in. We'll do this in an organized fashion so that everything makes sense, and we'll get started. The first thing we have to do is read off this disclaimer because we're lawyers, disclaimers, lawyers. It's all part of the same package. This webinar is for educational purposes only. It is not legal advice. Laws vary by state, individual circumstances. The reason why we say that is that what we say on this webinar, you can't say, well, Alan said this is what I have to do. And I took all my money, I transferred it out. We don't want to have that situation arise. This is why we have disclaimers. It's why you sign 8,000 waivers when you go skiing or you go to a rock climbing club. It's just the way we protect ourselves. So before I minimize my face and we dive into our little project, let's talk about why Medicaid matters. Why is this so important? And I'm going to backtrack a little bit, talk about myself, and talk about why, how I got into this thing to start. With Medicaid, every individual in New York State has the ability to receive long-term care paid for by this program. Now, Medicaid is a federal program, which means it's tax supported and it's allowed to flourish in each individual state based on how the states manage it. And in New York State, we have federal resources, but it's administered by each of the individual counties. Every county has a slightly different wrinkle or a slightly different mechanism for dealing with Medicaid, even though the overall thresholds and everything is similar, and it should be that way. But again, we have different experiences in different states, in different counties. So Medicaid is a federal program administered through the state and the counties. And how I got into it many years ago when I was in Brooklyn Law School, and I figured out that elder law is what I wanted to do. And again, it was a very new field. Only a few firms, a few people had been doing it. And one of the things I discovered was when I was working for this very small law firm in Manhattan, they said, here, we're going to do Medicaid applications. And I was like, what? Medicaid applications? What's this? I was doing wills. I had some understanding in law school based on how estates work. But Medicaid was a completely different phenomenon. And at the time, they gave me this blue application that was attached, and you had to type on it to basically have all the information put in. And what it did was it allowed a person to apply, in that case was to New York City Human Resources, HRA, to receive long-term care services. Now, the vast majority of the cases I was working on were nursing home cases. Somebody would become ill, go into a nursing home, and they had to apply for Medicaid benefits because even back then, the cost of going into a nursing home was incredibly high. In those days, it was 6,000, 8,000. Now it's 16, 18, sometimes 20,000. And if you think most people have that kind of money lying around to pay for 2 years or 3 years, that's not the case. That money will disappear very quickly. So when I jumped into Medicaid as a young law clerk, I got a real fast education in terms of how you pay for long-term care when someone gets sick. Medicare doesn't do that, and we'll go into that. But that was my introduction as a young law clerk coming from Brooklyn Law School, sitting in this little office in Manhattan, and they threw this application at me, and I had to figure out how to fill it out, get the information, and then submit that whole information to basically a couple of people in the middle of Manhattan to review. And that was the whole Medicaid process as far as I learned. But we'll dive into it, and we'll have some fun with this. So why long-term care planning cannot be ignored? Think about the math on this. Nearly 70% of adults over 65 will need some form of long-term care. Now, the other 30%, we don't want to talk about what happens there, but for 70% of adults, you're going to need, whether it's some type of home care, assisted living, nursing home, or something in between that, memory care maybe. And that's a tremendous amount of people. We're talking about, almost 3/4 of all adults in the United States need this level of care. And how do you pay for it? If you don't have the resources or long-term care insurance, you have to have Medicaid. And as we talked about a few seconds ago, New York nursing home costs can exceed $150,000 per year. That is a tremendous amount of money. And if you think covering that privately it makes sense, you're going to be having a lot of issues. And the thing is about Medicaid, what I've been talking to people for almost 30 years about, is that, people, the Medicaid process, because it feels so daunting, it feels so foreign, it feels like there's so many hoops to jump through, that they think, we can manage this, we can pay out of pocket, we can do all these things. This third little bubble, is really gets to the heart of it. Many families underestimate how quickly savings are depleted to pay all these long-term care bills, whether it's even home care, even to pay $35 an hour, $45 an hour to get care in the house. It's so amazing to me how people don't understand that money is going to disappear very, very quickly. The money that you spent and your family, your parents, basically worked 30, 40, 50 years to build and hone and invest, that money will disappear in a heartbeat. And I think it's just a waste to do that. One of the reasons why I'm such a big proponent of good Medicaid planning is that you don't work 40, 50 years to have that money disappear in 6 months, a year, 2 years. You want to preserve your assets for your loved ones, your spouse, your family, your kids. There's no reason not to take advantage of this type of planning. And we live in New York, one of the best planning states. So this is why it's so important. The other and final bubble on this page, which I think is important to understand, is crisis decisions are often rushed and costly. People panic when a loved one goes into a hospital and then has to be discharged to rehabilitation. And they're on the clock. And New York State, in terms of the Medicare to Medicaid transition, it can be stressful because facilities will add stress and say, what are you going to do? What's your plan? So just how we handle the stress is you deal with professionals like the fellow group we see. You deal with people who handle this every single day. You really want to have people that know what they're doing and manage this so that you don't have this stress build upon itself. This part of the Medicaid planning is, again, we have to include this because the emotional and financial impact is so profound, and people, maybe they get a sense of it. Maybe after this webinar, you'll digest it appropriately. But all of us have been through with our family and our loved ones. Medical events happen unexpectedly. There'll be a situation where a loved one, a parent, a spouse has been going along, doing what they normally do, and then they have a fall or an accident or a medical emergency. And then they're in this system. They're in this healthcare system, which follows them from hospitalization diagnosis, treatment, to discharge to rehabilitation. And then from there, what are we going to do? And that's the unexpected nature of all of this. Spouses may face financial instability. You have a situation where one spouse was the breadwinner, earned the money, has a nice income pension, and the other spouse does not. If a spouse becomes ill and goes into a nursing home, yes, maybe some portion of it will be used to offset some of these costs and go to the spouse living at home, but a majority of the income for that spouse could go to a nursing home. And we'll go over some of the rules on that. And what happens is, yeah, a spouse may be put in a vulnerable position unless we plan. And then we get to things like family disagreements. You know, some people may want the loved one to stay at home and get home care. Another person in the family may say, well, this is logistically very difficult. We can't have dad stay at home. The house is a high ranch in the Hudson Valley. It's very hard to deal with going in and out, getting aides in and out. It's a real pain. So nursing home is the best option. And then, of course, stress overall rises when care and finances are uncertain. Now, everyone, I hope, who's joining me today on this webinar has also downloaded their workbook, because I think part of this education, what we always do every month, is have you process your own thoughts and your own questions. You know, I want you to at least put as a starting point, what is your current understanding of Medicaid? What family concerns do you have about long-term care costs? And I want you to write it down and go over this, because this will help you figure out what makes sense about Medicaid planning and why you need to do it. And here's the other question for number 3. Are there any family members who might need Medicaid soon? Is it a parent? Is it a spouse? Is it a child? Is it a sibling? Who on the horizon will need this type of care? And it could be home care. It could be assisted living Medicaid. It could be nursing home Medicaid. Yeah, it could be anything like that. Think about it. And of course, what is your biggest fear about paying for long-term care? Are there enough resources to cover a period of time, or is there not enough? So why are we here? We're here to understand Medicaid in New York. And the reason why I always say that Medicaid is so flexible in New York is that other states do not give the Medicaid applicant a large enough resource limit to maintain. Most states will allow you to keep $1,300, $1,500, $1,100, somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 of assets, and everything else basically has to be either transferred out, paid for, gifted. It's or which create penalties. It's a very restrictive system in most states. New York, 2026, allows you to keep $33,038, basically $33,038 of assets. And that doesn't include qualified retirement accounts. It doesn't include IRAs, 403Bs, 401Ks. The principal amount of those accounts are also exempt. Your primary residence, especially in a home care situation, is exempt from Medicaid consideration. And if you plan correctly, you won't have to deal with a Medicaid lien or a state recovery. So if you put together, for example, like Connecticut versus New York, Connecticut is less than $2,000 of assets that you're allowed to keep besides retirement accounts. And then New York allows you to keep $33,038. That's a sizable amount. And very few states have anything close to that. So that's why we talk about Medicaid being a flexible state in New York. It's pretty amazing. So let's put this into perspective. Let's define our terms. So as you're going through this and you're working on your workbook and you have your pen and you're scribbling, writing notes, let's talk about how eligibility for Medicaid works. Again, as we talked about, Medicaid is a state-administered program under the federal guidelines. There's a giant book. We call it the MRG, MRG, or the Medicaid Reference Guide. And this thing's like 900 pages. I made the mistake, and I put this in an article last year or the year before. I was on computers about 15, 17 years ago, and I just wanted to print one page of the MERG, the Medicaid Reference Guide, because I had a fair hearing I had to attend in New York City, and each page has its own uh, rules and regulations that we use to guide us through Medicaid issues. And of course, I pressed print, and I thought, okay, I'm just printing, page 37. Meanwhile, 37 didn't pop up. It turns out I was printing 900 pages. So, of course, the printer just kept going and I couldn't shut it off. So, at some point, I had the entire Medicaid reference guide in paper form, which is not ideal, but that was one of my fun Medicaid moments. But let's go over this. Eligibility for Medicaid depends on income, assets, and of course, your medical needs. And the last part of that is very important. And we can even start with that. Over the last year, Medicaid rules have changed, requiring a minimum of 3 activities of daily living to be compromised so that you can become eligible for Medicaid services based on your physical health. Now, that's a little different from before, where if you could show that, and Medicaid, when they came out and you had, for example, you had services and people come out for guidelines and for reviews and for assessments. They would see, okay, this person is under a disability. They need care. Now they have to document a minimum of 3 activities of daily living you have trouble with, whether it's bathing, whether it's toileting, whether it's nutrition, whether it's mobility, all the different things. You have to have a minimum of 3. Which, of course, you may have someone who's older, who has slowed down, has some limitations. They may only have 1 or 2 limitations on activities of daily living. And that's not enough to be eligible for Medicaid. So I want you to think about that, especially in a home care situation. But in New York State, in 2026, as far as income goes, you are allowed to keep up to $1,836 per month as a single person. And anything in excess of that has to either be paid towards your cost of care or get placed in a supplemental needs pooled income trust. And that is a very important thing to understand. When you apply for Medicaid home care, even assisted living Medicaid, you're able to keep more income than the Medicaid allowance by having it in the special pool trust. I want everyone to understand that. So, for example, if you have a pension, you have Social Security, let's say you make $4,000, $5,000 a month. The first $1,836 that comes in from these direct deposits stays in your account. You do whatever you want with. The excess income then gets deposited into a special pool trust. There's dozens of these not-for-profit agencies that run these pool trusts. You deposit the excess income, every month, and then you can either they give you a debit card to pay your bills, expenses. You want to buy things, from the drugstore. You can have that paid, and the pool trust will basically pay it out of that debit card. If you want repairs in your house, they can do that. They can pay that. It can't benefit a third party. You can't use it to buy life insurance premiums or anything like that. But for example, if you wanted to, get a new couch, you can have your pool trust excess income used for that. And even the more interesting, let's say, for example, you moved in with your son or your daughter, and they own the house, and you're living there. They can charge you rent, so which means your excess income can go from your special pool trust account to your kids as rental income. Pretty cool. So it all stays within the family. But that 1836 is the Medicaid income limit. Assets, as we talked about, 33038. And of course, if there's 2 people applying for Medicaid services for home care, that asset allowance is up to 44,796. Now, just to keep in mind also, if your retirement accounts are qualified, IRAs, 401ks, the full principal balance is exempt from Medicaid consideration. So if you have $1 million, $2 million in a retirement account, that principal is exempt. You can apply for Medicaid benefits, which is pretty cool. The other thing that's not so cool is the distributions that come out of it, because in order for those accounts to be considered exempt, they have to be in what's called payout status, which means they're getting their RMDs or distributions. That distribution counts towards your income. So if you get a high amount coming from your retirement accounts, that's going to add and bump up your income. But just keep in mind. Now, as far as number three, rules differ for nursing homes versus home care programs. When it comes to Medicaid home care and community based Medicaid services, again, there's no look back or penalty period in New York. There's a 3 month review of your income, but there's no penalizable transfer amount when it comes to home care or assisted living Medicaid. So when people talk about community based Medicaid services, which means, again, let's say, for example, you went to the hospital, you had some rehabilitation services and rehab, and then you were discharged back to your home. You are then able and eligible, you can get Medicaid home care services under community Medicaid, which means you apply for Medicaid, your assets are below 33,038, you have your income, which is set with a trust. Medicaid approves you because you have some activities of daily living, more than three. There are three that are impacted. And then you apply for services. And even if you had to transfer some money out to a child or to a trust, there's no penalties for that. But if that same person is in the rehab, they can't go home, they're sick, they need to stay in a nursing home. Nursing home Medicaid has a 5-year look back, which everyone is familiar with, I'm sure, at this point. And they look to see every transfer, every single transaction that you've done over 5 years to see if you've gifted money to kids, other third parties, and they can penalize that. If you've given, let's say you give 50,000, 80,000 over those years, they can then penalize it. And the way those penalties work is that they take that round number. Let's say you gave 80,000 to your kids. They would then divide it by what's called the regional or average nursing home rate for our counties, which are, Putnam or Orange or Rockland, and that amount is $15,024. So they divide the two up, and then they get a number of months that you have to privately pay before Medicaid can pick up again. So again, these are all of the little nuances of the Medicaid program, but that's the 5-year look back. So home care, assisted living Medicaid, you can transfer your resources, apply for Medicaid, you're fine, no issues, you're going to get approved. Nursing home, the issue, of course, is that if you have these assets and then you have to transfer it, you can have penalties. And there's tricks to doing that too, but it's not great. So that's the difference between the two programs. And if you're married, if you have a partner and spouse and you are married in the state of New York, not just living together, and you're actually legally married, you could then transfer assets between each other. Those are exempt transfers for Medicaid purposes. So, for example, let's say you have $2 million, you transfer that amount from either joint accounts or from a sick person's assets to the healthy person, and then you apply for Medicaid, whether it's nursing home or home care, that is an exempt transfer. And you can apply and become eligible for Medicaid services, whether it's nursing home, home care. Because even though it's within the 5-year look back, and this is very important, it's within the 5-year look back, but you're gifting it to a spouse. That's an exempt transfer. You can transfer all your money the day before you apply for nursing home Medicaid. That's exempt and not penalizable. Of course, when the application goes through, you also have to include a spousal refusal form, because unless you do spousal refusal, Medicaid would look at the married couple as one entity, add all the resources together, and still deny your application. Spousal refusal is a special letter that we give to Department of Social Services, Medicaid, that tells them only look at the sick person's assets and income. Do not look at the healthy person, because spousal refusal basically says just look at their resources and allow them to become eligible. And of course, if you have millions of dollars, Medicaid can ask the spouse who refused that refusal letter to potentially contribute toward their cost of care. But historically, unless you have significant major millions of dollars or major assets, they tend not to do that, especially in smaller amounts. Just understand that point. One thing to keep in mind too, because of the types of rules that New York administers in Medicaid, always a smart idea to work with a professional who knows how this stuff works, knows the ins and outs. You don't want to deal with non-lawyers in this situation. This is a very common thing. Our office, we have lawyers working with a Medicaid coordinator who knows the processes. But that's why you need both working together, and you can't just rely on a lawyer because a lot of these things do have legalistic perspectives. And I know people have done that and they use non-lawyers, but if something happens, then you still have to find a lawyer and deal with fair hearings and deal with legal maneuvering and special estate planning. It's always good to have everything together. We've always done Medicaid planning as a unified force. I've always believed this since I was a young kid in my 20s doing this work, that if you have both components, the social work aspect, the coordination, and the elder law estate planning expertise, then the Medicaid planning is full featured, will protect the family in the short term while the emergency is going on. They have the care set up, and then have the estate planning and the probate protections on the back end so the family is fully protected too. You need everything to work together. So just to repeat, asset limits, again, they apply to individuals. If you're over those Medicaid limits, if you're over that 33,000, I mean, if for home care and for assisted living, you could just transfer it out to the individuals. You could put into an irrevocable trust, and it's fine. Nursing home, have to be a little more careful because you can't, in an emergency, you can't just transfer all your assets unless you have a spouse or a disabled child or something part of the exemptions. And the thing is, in New York, for example, if you have a child living with you who's lived with you more than 2 years, and let's say you own your house, you can transfer the house to that adult child. That's called the caregiver child rule. That will avoid a Medicaid penalty, especially in nursing home. Home care doesn't really matter. Assisted living doesn't really matter. There's no penalties. But for nursing home, that caregiver child rule is very important. But this is something to keep in mind too. When you have assets above that Medicaid limit and you need nursing home care, one of the tricks that we use, I don't know, I hate to use the trick, but one of the steps that we take is what's called a promissory note. A promissory note in New York takes these excess resources in a nursing home case and is able to protect somewhere in the 60 to 65% range, and the other 30-35% will be paid toward the nursing home. And it's done on a monthly basis, but that is a way to preserve at least a good chunk of your assets without having to give up 100%. Now, of course, certain assets are exempt because, again, we talked about primary residence for home care. We talk about you're allowed to have one vehicle, and of course, your qualified retirement accounts. And of course, there are other certain types of income through, used to be Holocaust reparations, things like there are certain other things. If you're a veteran and you get aid in attendance, that aid in attendance check that comes from the VA, that's also an exempt income stream. As far as spending down options, again, the simplistic perspective that a lot of facilities used to say, well, just spend all your assets down and then apply for Medicaid. Spending down can be done intelligently. So if you're a person, again, you're trying to set your Medicaid planning up, and one easy way is to do a pre-need irrevocable funeral plan. That's not revocable. If you go into your local funeral parlor or you have a long-standing tradition working with a funeral home, you go in, you say, I want to get a pre-need irrevocable funeral plan for Medicaid planning. Then you can prepay your funeral, set the cost right now, and that money doesn't count towards your Medicaid limits and your asset totals, but you've already established this valuable resource. So that's something, a way to pay down. There are other things you can prepay ahead of time, especially if you're going to a nursing home, you don't want to gift money, you can pay taxes, you can do things to pay down. But I always like to say, first see all the possible ways you can protect your money before you spend it. And as far as coordinated planning, when you work with an elder law attorney, you work with an experienced professional, they can set up an irrevocable trust, for example, a Medicaid income-only irrevocable trust. Sometimes you call it asset protection trust. You can put your primary residence and other properties in. You can put other assets in, and then start the clock. The earlier you do it, if you do it within the 5 years, you will have protected those assets should one or both spouses, for example, become ill. It's so important to do this planning early because not only with the Medicaid trust, you avoid probate, but especially, let's say you have a summer house or you have a Florida condo. You can put everything into that irrevocable trust, even though it's New York, because trusts can pass anywhere. There are things called situs of trust clauses. You can have a trust basically anywhere in the United States. And then you can protect properties in multiple jurisdictions, avoiding probate, plus the Medicaid protection. It's just such a great idea to do it early. You don't want to rush. So when you go through your checklist and you have your workbook, you can say, yeah, besides which family members right now would be eligible for Medicaid and which would have to do planning. And then what assets do you own that could impact eligibility? And again, this is all part of your own education. So when you work on this and you set a sense of how we can jump into action should you need to, how familiar are you with the income limits in New York? Now you've understood. We've talked about it. And again, what current or anticipated medical needs for your family are on their way. Just look objectively at your family and what can be done to prepare ahead of time. So let's get into the myths. This is something that for almost 30 years I've been going over what things Medicaid is versus what things Medicaid isn't. The old myth was, well, I'm not eligible for Medicaid. I can't apply and become Medicaid eligible. They still said, even today and yesterday, people would call and say, well, I'm not eligible for Medicaid. We can't be applying for that. We have too many resources. And the first myth is Medicaid is only for low income people. Let's get to the truth. The truth is eligibility is based on medical needs and financial criteria. Middle class families, upper middle class families in New York can apply because Medicaid in New York has flexible options and the ability to move money and transfer resources to become eligible. And I think the legislators in New York, as they adapted the Medicaid rules from the federal government and adjusted it for the state, they realized New York is a very expensive place to live. Maybe if you go to South Carolina or you go to North Carolina, cost of living, and now it's a little different, but it used to be cost of living is significantly less. And of course, the Medicaid rules kind of follow that. New York, you need a tremendous amount of money to live a comfortable lifestyle or a reasonable lifestyle. And because of that, all the different income and asset thresholds and protections on the back end were based on that assumption. So just because you have 800,000, a million, 2 million, and they think, well, I'm not eligible, I will say, yes, you are eligible. Because as far as New York is concerned, you're middle class, upper middle class. You're not super wealthy as far as New York is concerned. And just because you have savings and you have investment accounts doesn't mean you're automatically disqualified. You can take that money, protect it, move it, transfer it. There are things we can do to protect those resources for your loved ones, for your family, and to not take advantage of these, legal protections doesn't make sense. That's why we're here, to protect your family's resources and get the proper care for your loved ones. And if you've done the planning, it changes all of the outcomes and it gives you a sense of freedom. And I know that people think about Medicaid planning as something restrictive and they don't have the freedom to make maneuver and have control over assets. But the thing is, if you lose your money from lack of planning, that's loss of control. That doesn't help you, and your family is going to suffer because of it. The best control is a good plan. And one of the reasons why this myth persists to this day, even to this afternoon, this morning, is that people think about Medicare and Medicaid as being something equivalent. Medicare is your standard health insurance for anyone either 65 or disabled, and that pays your doctor bills, hospitalizations, 100 days of rehab up to, and all these types of things. Whereas Medicaid only covers long-term care, and you can be dual eligible. Years ago, that wasn't the case. Medicaid was its own takeover for Medicare, but now it's dual eligible, and you could have Medicare for health insurance and Medicaid for their long-term care. The myth persists as well because people fear losing all their assets and losing control. But meanwhile, if you don't set things in motion and plan, then your losses will be real because you didn't plan. Of course, outdated information. People read something in 2005. They talked to their family member who had their mom on Medicaid in 2010. Things have changed, and a lot of the rules, a lot of the planning aspects have evolved. Just talk to someone professional that knows how to do this. So now that you've had this little bit of insight, now that do you realize who your family now might qualify, and are there assets now you think would prevent eligibility? So when you do your workbook, you know, did you think that Medicaid was an option for you? And now you can see how it is. And you also now can see how early planning changes your eligibility. So let's dig into our favorite. Medicare and Medicaid are the same. And let's dig into this because people confuse the two all the time. In fact, half the conversations they talk about Medicare, they talk about Medicaid, and they interchange it. And of course, they're very different. Medicare covers hospital stays. It covers limited skilled nursing and short-term rehab. We're talking about, again, if you go into rehabilitation, you have up to 100 days where Medicare covers. But again, the first 20 days it covers 100%. The next 80 days it only covers 80%. We always tell our clients and the people we deal with that have a supplemental insurance policy paired with your Medicare, whether it's an ARP or Empire Blue Cross Blue Shield, or if you've done something through employment, always good to have the supplemental, because with the supplemental that's functional and your Medicare, you can cover up to 100% for those 100 days that you're in rehabilitation after hospitalization. So the typical trajectory is, there's a fall, there's a heart attack, there's some type of acute medical crisis. They go into a hospital, they get treated, they get some procedures done, and then, of course, they discharge to a rehabilitation because you're not strong enough to go home yet. You've been in the hospital, you've weakened, there's been some muscle loss. So you get placed and discharged to a rehabilitation. And then, of course, you have your up to 100 days covered by Medicare. First 20 days, 100%, next 80 days, 80%. And of course, that's only if you are making progress. If you plateau, if your care stops and you're not making any headway, then of course, the facility, Medicare, can choose to stop that coverage. And then either you're going home or you have to stay and have Medicaid handle that. So that's the Medicare process. Of course, you can appeal Medicare decisions, but that's the thing when you go into a facility. It does not cover custodial care. Medicare, once you get past 100 days or once the cutoff is happening, they do not cover. Medicare has a very limited, for 6 weeks, some home care, visiting nurse type of situation, but it's not going to cover custodial long-term care. That you need Medicaid or long-term care insurance or private pay. And of course, why this myth persists, Medicare, is sometimes you talk to nursing homes, you talk to the facilities, and people are not versed in these different rules and understanding. So they spread these myths. Same thing with in-home health services that are covered and adult daycare, which may be Medicare. But the thing is, we have waiver community-based programs, which are Medicaid programs, and that's very important. Medicaid is not just the simple 1, 2, 3. We have special waivered programs that gives additional services, higher level of services. There's traumatic brain injury services. There used to be NHTD, which is capped, which gives you 24 hours of home care. That's nursing home quality care in your house. That's been capped. But again, Medicaid versus Medicare. Medicare is limited for this type of situation. Medicaid gives you more services. So when you look at your workbook and you say, okay, well, did you assume that Medicare would cover your long-term care? Is that what you understood? Write that down. And of course, what care needs might your family face that Medicare doesn't cover? And for most people, that'll be long-term custodial care. And then how would you pay for long-term care without Medicaid? Do you have a long-term care insurance policy? 25 years ago, 30 years ago, those policies were very popular. People would work with Genworth, which was GE, or John Hancock, or a few other companies to get special long-term care insurance. New York had a partnership plan, which would give you Medicaid coverage if you needed to have long-term care insurance cover for the first 3 years in the facility. Of course, the premiums were astronomical, but it would give you automatic Medicaid. So I dealt with those plans. So that was also part of long-term care planning back 25 years ago. That has since diminished. People don't want to pay these high premiums. There's more hybrid life insurance and Medicaid type of long-term care insurance specialty plans, but again, very expensive. You don't see them very much. Most of them you just see plain hybrid life insurance or utilize long-term care insurance. So again, what steps can you take now to clarify coverage differences? What things can you do? Usually, talk to a professional. Myth number 3, you must give up your home or lose your home. Well, guess what? If you're getting home care, your primary residence is an exempt asset for Medicaid purposes. Now, that doesn't mean that Medicaid can't put a lien on it or do state recovery if you don't plan properly. But for eligibility purposes, you can still own a home, own retirement accounts, and apply and receive Medicaid benefits for home care. Now, for assisted living and nursing home, if you own your primary residence, that will actually disqualify you for Medicaid because unless you have some specific things met. For example, if you go into a nursing home and you still own your house, we have to do what's called a intent to return home letter to preserve the house. It's supposed to be 6 months. It usually goes longer than that, but that allows a person to still be eligible for Medicaid services and get nursing home quality services, but still have their home for a period of time. You're going to have to either sell the property, another alternative. But that's for nursing. Assisted living too. If you own your home under your name and you're applying for assisted living services, assisted living facility, what we call it ALP, congregate care level 3, you have to have the house out of your name. But that you can just transfer directly or into a trust, and there's no penalty. But nursing home is a little tricky. Equity limit supply. So if you have, let's say you have a tremendous, let's say the house is well over $1 million and you own the property there, then again, that would be an issue as far as eligibility, having a house. Yeah, that's something to consider too. So if you have a tremendously valuable house, that could affect how the house is viewed for Medicaid purposes. As far as we talked about intent to return home matters for nursing home, but also spouses too. Now, if a spouse is residing in the house, and there would be no Medicaid lien or state recovery at that point, based on the fact that their spouse is living in the community and in their house. So it's another way to protect the house if you have to go into a nursing home. So again, the planning strategies that an elder law attorney is going to employ in this situation, we're going to do a Medicaid asset protection trust, Medicaid income trust. It's a very similar thing, but that's the idea of preserving your assets for the 5-year look back, or even if you needed home care, it's out of your name. And the way those trusts work is that you're transferring assets from your name, your social security number, to this trust, which has its own separate tax ID number, EIN number, which is separate and distinct from you. And again, allows your assets to pass to your loved ones without going through probate, and allowing you to become eligible for Medicaid services. Strategic transfers. You can obviously give money to kids that are disabled, that's exempt transfer, or to if they have supplemental needs trusts. So that's one thing. If you have disabled children in your family, you can protect assets for their benefit and also still receive Medicaid benefits without a penalty. Spouses, of course. So that type of strategic transfer, plus the caregiver child rule. There's even a caregiver sibling or a sibling rule. For example, let's say you and a sibling, a brother, sister, you own a piece of property that your parents had originally, they gave it to you, and you both live together, or you're both, for example, in the same property. You could transfer your interest to your sibling without a penalty if you meet those guidelines. Pretty cool stuff. As far as coordinated estate planning, again, this is part of getting your documents, your power of attorney, your wills, your trust, everything in order so that the loved ones can make transfers as needed in case you can't. And again, early timing is critical. If you're doing this in a period of time in your 50s, 60s, 70s, before illness has hit, it gives you the most amount of time to protect your assets. I always say just do it early. I mean, my wife and I, we had a conversation, and I do this for a living, but he's like, can we do our estate planning ahead of time, get this done early? And we did. It's just one less thing to worry about. You have plenty of things to worry about. You have vacations to plan, fun things to do. This is one of those, just knock it out. So when you do your own evaluation, you have your workbook. Again, does your home's equity affect eligibility? Do you have a significantly high home equity? Keep that in mind. Are there other assets that you own? Are there boats? Do you have other expensive assets that need protecting? Again, in a trust, we can put your residences, summer home, boats, trailers. You can put a whole range of financial assets. You can put investment accounts. Again, I wouldn't, you can't put retirement accounts. Don't put qualified retirement accounts. You're not going to give up your checking account that has your social security deposits, but other assets that you don't use. You can leave money aside that you still use it and have control over, but money that you're not expecting to use or deal with anytime soon, that can go into a trust. Again, and who are your trustees? Most people will be their adult children or siblings. Would you consider a trust to protect your home? I talked about trusts extensively. I would say a trust is one of your best bets because it organizes everything, puts everything in one place. You avoid court issues, no probate, and you have the Medicaid protection. Plus, you can set up very specific instructions. Let's say one of your children is a spendthrift, the other is a very responsible person. The irresponsible child could have money kept in trust and get an income stream over many years, as opposed to a lump sum where they'll just blow it. So you have a trust that can create so many cool instructions. And again, what steps today can you take to preserve your residence? What can you do? Lots of things. Yeah, you can, besides retitling, putting into trust, there's different things we can do. So myth number 4, one of the classic myths that we deal with, gifting is always safe. And it's not. Medicaid has, of course, the nursing home has a 5-year look back. So when you make gifts, and this is something we see all the time, oh, well, the IRS allows us to gift this amount. It's our annual exclusion. And the funny thing is, yeah, all it does is you can gift money and not have to file a gift tax return. But unless you have a taxable estate, or New York or federal, and you have many, many, many millions of dollars, it's not a big deal whether you file a gift tax return or don't file a gift tax return. But if you gift money and then you apply for Medicaid within 5 years, those are penalizable transfers. The gifts you give to your kids, even if it's for a good cause, for graduation, for birthdays, for down payment on houses. The problem is that's a penalizable transfer. That will be used to basically penalize you, and you'll have to pay out of pocket for a month, 2 months, 3 months for nursing. So be careful gifting. I mean, the first thing is I always tell people is create a trust, have the resources there. There are gifting allowances in the trust, which can be utilized through the trustees, but you don't have to gift yourself and have a penalty. And of course, if you get a penalty, as we talked about, that delays your eligibility. It means you're paying privately for this penalty before Medicaid can even kick in. So you may lose 10, 20, 30,000 unnecessarily. We don't want that. And of course, everything is time-based. If you screw it up on the timing side, yeah, this affects you. The earlier we do stuff, the better our planning is. We avoid this kind of problem. Smart versus risky. We'll say this to we're blue in the face. Informal gifting causes delays. Yeah, you give as we talked, you give gift, birthday, this money, that money. It's not protected. It wasn't done through trust. It just creates penalties. And of course, same thing with documentation. The worst thing you do, you withdraw $20,000 in cash for whatever purpose you're doing that for, then Medicaid thinks that you're gifting that money away, and they'll ask for more documentation. I'm not saying you have to live your whole life in anticipation of the Medicaid review, but try to be careful moving money around, gifting money, and also withdrawing large amounts of cash. So especially if you know down the line you may need some care, there's things that professional can guide you. And again, strategic gifting requires careful planning. We talked about this. Trust planning is usually the best way to do it. So if you have an elder attorney, a person that knows what they're doing, they'll help you with this. They'll be, very, this is a granular thing. We'll get into the weeds with it. We'll talk about it. We'll come up with a plan to fix this. Because if you just do it on your own, it's like me trying to do some brain surgery. I mean, I'm going to be in trouble. I'm probably going to not be able to speak, which my wife would be ecstatic about. But that's why I don't do my own brain surgery, or I don't, rebuild my car's engine, because Yeah, okay, maybe I can get pretty far, but that thing is going to be sputtering on the highway because again, I'm not an expert at it. So when you do your own review right now, as we're doing this, have you gifted assets in the last 5 years? Think about it, and how much? And think about it. Can those gifts affect eligibility? Of course they can. And would you adjust your gifting timing in the future for planning purposes? And I think you should. And then who should you be including in your gift planning discussions? I think a good elder law attorney and your family working together can set this up. Myth number 5, Medicaid only covers nursing homes. Well, we know that's not true. Now, we have in-home community-based services. We have the NHTD program when it's working, which is your 24-hour nursing home. You have TBI. You have adult day programs that's covered. So, for example, even if the person's at home all day getting some services, they can be transported to an adult facility for adult daycare. And that has socialization, nutrition, and that's a Medicaid-approved plan as far as care coordination also. So Medicaid also has assisted living services, and that's one of my favorite. For example, you have home care, but you also have assisted living. So assisted living Medicaid out level 3 means you can go to a really nice facility that has Medicaid out beds, and you could stay in that. And sometimes there's roommates, not the greatest thing, but Medicaid will then pay for the majority of your stay at the assisted living. And it's not nursing homes. Assisted livings, many of them are like really nice hotels where you get, full free meals, entertainment, health care on site, possible transportation. It's a really cool alternative to staying at home, especially if the logistics don't work. And you're safe, and they'll send you to the hospital if something happens. They're on top of it. I'm a big believer in good assisted living programs through Medicaid. As far as planning for care, yeah, some people prefer aging at home, some people prefer other facilities. Just get your planning and core decision making intact now. So when you think about yourself, do you prefer having your care at home or a facility? Now, some people like to be at home, and some people say, well, it's too messy, it's too crazy, there's hoarding stuff going on. I want to be in a clean, nice facility. My family prefers it. And then why? And then, of course, with in-home services, again, how would you arrange that? Would you be on a bottom floor, a rec room, a basement? Would you have your own entrance? How would you set up your home care if you had to? And then again, with a waivered program, would you need it at this point? One of the programs we have is consumer directed. As far as finding aids can be difficult in the Hudson Valley. And so often people would choose a loved one, a family member, child, nephew, sibling to be their caregiver, and Medicaid will pay them. The way it works is when you apply and become eligible for Medicaid on the financial side, we've done the application, then you have an assessment. And the assessment, usually people come to the house, see what the person's needs are, and then assign number of hours. Now, these are called MLTCs, that are Managed Long-Term Care Agencies. And you choose one to work with. Every county has a whole list of different MLTCs. They will then provide the hours and basically pay. If it's your own person under the consumer directed program, then they will pay your child or sibling money or a neighbor to cover those costs. Or if they don't have someone available to do that, then you can hire an agency, and then the agency will be covered by Medicaid. And if you don't like the hours, you can always appeal the hours or move agencies. Not the easiest thing, but you can do that too. Myth number 6, planning can wait. You know what? How about this? Don't wait. Waiting is risky. Of course it's risky, because when you wait and bad things happen, then you're into emergency status, and then we're doing emergency planning. And guess what? When you do emergency planning, you lose money, because then we're taking shortcuts and we're losing all the benefits of trust planning and specialized transfers. It's just not worth it. So don't wait. Waiting is a bad idea. This is one of those things, the earlier you do it, it's done, protected. The best feeling I get is someone comes in, Alan, we did this planning 15 years ago, 20 years ago. We need it now. Everything is all set. It's just pushing a few buttons, taking care of things, and everything moves very smoothly. And everyone's, they may not be happy with a loved one's decline, but they're happy that things are taken care of. And the same thing, early planning reduces conflict, protects assets, gives you the most up to date options to handle things because then you've already done your work. We can tweak things. So when you think about what you can do today to start your planning, be objective. What things can you get done now? And then, are there financial factors making planning urgent? What conversations should occur before anything happens? Are there people in the family you have to go over this and really convince? And again, how can early planning benefit younger family members? By having good trust planning, good estate planning, then resources could then flow to where they belong, to your children, to grandchildren, potentially down the line. And asset protection is part of this whole Medicaid planning scenario. We're protecting a family, we're making the family stronger by getting things done early. As far as lesser known Medicaid facts, well, okay, I feel we've done it all the way. So for community spouse resource allowance, for example, when someone goes into a nursing home, now spouses can keep significant assets and still apply for Medicaid and not have to do spousal refusal. I still like to do spousal refusal, but that's one of the benefits when someone goes into a nursing home and a spouse lives in the community. They can usually have north of 150 to 160,000 assets, not including retirement accounts, which could then allow them to stay in the facility, and the spouse can stay at home and not have to do a spouse refusal. We still like to do it because most people may have resources close to above that. Income diversion, we talked about where, for example, let's say a spouse has a higher income, the spouse lives at home, who's healthier, has a lower income, money can be moved to the lower income made person, and that does protect, but still the majority of the income would still go to a nursing home. But they do have that so the spouse is not considered impoverished or their lifestyle is diminished to too great a degree. But of course, if that spouse had a professional job, then they may not be eligible for diversion. So that's the danger in New York when you have had two people who are successful and have earned money over a lifetime. Now, as far as part of a situation where you have your income and resources appraised by New York State, and they look at everything, if there's an impoverishment situation, we can put that in writing to Medicaid and they can consider it for the application. So one thing about New York, there's a level of humanity that other states don't have, so that a person is not completely under the gun in a healthcare crisis. Again, the spousal protections we talked about with spouse refusal, again, just keep that in mind. It's a great benefit to be a spouse. If you have a partner, you live together with someone for 30 years, you share a house together, but you're not married. I've had to be in the position where I've told people, I don't know what your romantic situation is, get married, get it legal so that we can do this Medicaid planning. Otherwise, you're going to lose it. And that's happened with someone who's ill, is not feeling great, who's required some care. And again, I don't want to be, like it's Fiddler on the Roof. I'm not here to set up any romantic partnerships. I just know if you've been living together for 30 years, 40 years, you're partners, but you're not married, get married for Medicaid purposes. People think you have to get divorced for Medicaid purposes. Getting married in New York is a safer bet because you have the Medicaid protections. Now, as far as expanded care services in New York, of course, with Medicaid, you may have some additional hospice and respite services and therapy. Yeah, that is something that we can go into more depth. But again, New York has a lot of great benefits under the Medicaid program. Now, as far as we wrap things up, again, think about what facts today surprised you the most. And again, if anything we've talked about could change your planning approach, this is a good time to write it down. And other non-traditional services your family might need. What would make the most sense to keep your family intact and have a good care situation set up? Again, who in your family should be involved in Medicaid discussions? Is someone in the family a lawyer or accountant or in the healthcare field? You may want to bring people in for added guidance. The same thing. It all goes back to the same thing: waiting versus planning. Just when in doubt, plan. It's just so important. And the key takeaways as we wrap up, again, Medicaid covers so many more things than you realize. Early protection, early planning is a great thing. If you make mistakes or you delay, you're going to lose thousands of dollars. Medicaid will save you a tremendous amount of money. If you pay out of pocket, first it was $150,000 minimum. And if you have open conversations, it works out great. So when you do your final review, write down 3 lessons you learned today. What's your timeline for taking action? Who will involve in those discussions? What resources do you need to feel confident? So how do we work? The fellow group, when you call us, we give you a 30-minute case evaluation. Our intake specialist will go over the case, what you need, how to plan ahead. Once you agree, once your questions have been answered, you have a good sense of what you need to do, you sign a letter of engagement with our firm. We then set up a design meeting for planning, and then we review drafts of your estate planning for your wills, trusts, powers of attorney, and then we do a finalization. You sign everything, everything's done. You have your folder, and basically your planning is complete. And then you have us. You have us for as long as we're around to answer questions, guide you. This is, again, as far as our Medicaid system, we have a Medicaid coordinator who will work with you to make sure you become eligible for services, and you have all the legal expertise. You have decades of legal experience behind you. So if you schedule your free consultation for estate planning, you get $500 off of any estate planning documents. If we're doing a Medicaid trust and you're doing those documents, it's $500. All right, Q&A time. All right, let's see. Well, you can put it in the chat. You can put questions down, and I'm here to answer it. And even though it's 2:02, we have time. We can dig into questions and have a little fun. All right, let's see. Okay, so first question. If my parents have a life estate deed to avoid capital gains taxes, should we switch over to an irrevocable trust? Also, when is the look back starting for community-based Medicaid claims? So we'll do second question first. So the look back for community-based Medicaid, they've been threatening this now since the pandemic, since Cuomo passed this during 2020, and it has yet to come into fruition because there has to be a more extensive review from New York State. They have to put this into action. Medicaid right now doesn't have the wherewithal or the staffing to do look backs for every home care application. They'll be stuck for years doing it. I can still see them passing it because the fiscal requirements are starting to dig in. But right now there's nothing on the horizon showing that, and we'll get a good notice ahead of time before they can do it. As far as life estate deed, the main thing is if you put your property or your parents put your property into an irrevocable trust, they still retain life estate value in the trust. The trust has a built-in life estate. If you made a life estate deed with the deed showing it's been transferred to you as remainder people, and the parents have a life estate, the trust has the same thing. The parents still pay. They have a star exemption. They pay all the expenses on the house, so they actually will get a stepped-up basis. They pass away, and then you have to sell the property in the trust. You get the stepped-up basis based on date of death value. It's the same thing. So that's the best answer I can give, and that's what it does. If there's any other questions on that, we can keep asking because again we have a few more minutes. As far as let's take a look at other questions here. Can you convert or switch from home care to nursing? Yes. So the way it works is for many people, and it goes both ways. Let's say, for example, a person starts off with Medicaid home care and they have services in the home, but their care needs increase. They need nursing home. We can convert that home care application to a nursing home application. Of course, we have to submit the 5 years of statements, and then the package gets bigger, and we can do a conversion. And then vice versa. If someone's applied for a nursing home, been accepted, and then they have to go home, or let's say the family wants them home, yeah, we can convert it back to a home care application, which is much easier because that's a simpler application. So we can go both ways on that. Okay, next question. We have a second home which we are planning to sell. If we include it in a trust, can we sell it? So this happens a lot. What you can do, remember, the whole point of a trust is that you're starting the clock. because once the property goes in there, then that's everything begins from the date of that transfer. So let's say you decide to sell, it may take 6 months, 8 months, and then you'll get cash, and you still have to deal with the cash, or maybe purchase something else. But once that property is in the trust, yes, the house can be sold at any time. The only difference is with an irrevocable trust, you may have your adult children or someone else be your trustee if you choose, and then they would have to be the ones to sign the contract of sale, the closing documents. But again, if it's your instructions and they're a close family, they'll follow it. But that's the difference. You don't have direct control in the trust, but you've started the timeline. The earlier you start it, the more likely everything's going to be preserved if you get sick. Okay, let's see what else on the question side. I own a timeshare. Is this going to be an asset that's affecting my Medicaid eligibility? Well, yes. If you have a timeshare and it has a valuation and it's under your social security number, yes, that's an asset that actually you have to deal with. You have to either transfer it, sell it, and get rid of it, because otherwise, yes, if it's on your asset total, yes, that could affect your eligibility. Even something as silly as vacation home or Hilton Honors, you have a contract and you actually have that timeshare, that has value. So look at your assets, look at the resources you have available, and see what you have to do. And the same thing goes for life insurance. Many people have a whole life insurance plan with a cash surrender value. That's an asset. So the easiest thing to do is transfer the ownership of that, whether it's to a trust or to a spouse. You could leave the beneficiaries as is. But again, if you have a life insurance, that's whole life insurance with a cash surrender value, that's an asset that has to be done. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions before we wrap up. And let's take a look. So I see this question. How long does the Medicaid process take? Well, usually when we file a Medicaid home care application, it takes 30 to 45 days for either a decision from Medicaid approval, or they may ask for more documentation. There are expedited uh, deliveries where we can do things very quickly when somebody has immediate needs application. So it can be done quicker, but even with that process, and most DSS offices still take a few weeks to get it done. Nursing home is much longer. Nursing home is 5-year review. That can take many months before the application is either approved or denied. And let's see, I think that we may be at the end of the Q&A. I'll give you one last opportunity to do a question, but if not, then we're going to wrap up. It's 2:08, and I know I've taken up a lot of your time, but I'm really appreciative of everyone's um, participation today, and it's really been great uh, just giving you this information that I think will help you with your Medicaid planning and with some of your thinking about the future and how to set things up for your family, your loved ones. This has been really wonderful reaching out to everybody. And I love doing these webinars. This is a lot of fun for me. And I hope you got enough information out of it that makes sense. And again, it's a great opportunity. You can always give our office a call on main number 845-621-8640. You can get in touch with us. We can answer questions, set up consults. We're here for you. This is what we do. And I've been doing this almost 30 years, and I love it. Once again, thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today on the webinar. And I look forward to seeing everybody next month for our following program. I'm sure we'll do more planning stuff. And thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Good seeing everybody.